morning. So is everyone ready? Yes? Okay, good morning. My name is Eric Maurice. I'm the head of the Brussels office of the French think tank Fondation Robert Schuman. And I'm very happy to be in this beautiful and very institutional setting this year. It's a special year for the Prague Summit, which it's in its 5th edition, I think. It's the year we commemorate 15 years of the Czech Republic and other countries in the EU, and we commemorate also the 30 years of the fall of communism in Europe. Both events were linked to the idea of democracy and the idea of that Europe was the way to secure democracy in the longer term. When Czechia and its neighbors joined the EU in 2004, it was the year Jeremy Rifkin published his book, The European Dream. In it, Rifkin described the EU as a place where among the highest values we could find coexistence between different groups in societies, solidarity and universal human rights. The EU's normative power was at its peak. The rule of law was a strength for Europe and an example for the rest of the world. Today, the rule of law is still a key word when we talk about the EU, but the idea behind it has changed. In a world where the rules-based order is under pressure, the EU, maybe the last bearer of this principle, is itself facing a contestation of its own internal rules-based order. During the last European Parliament, which ended very recently, as you know it, MEPs adopted 11 resolutions about the rule of law, or more precisely, about concerns over the situation of the rule of law in the EU. 4 of them were about Hungary. The last one in September was to trigger the Article 7 procedure. 4 of them were about Poland. MEPs didn't trigger Article 7, but only because the European Commission did so before they had time to do it. The other 3 resolutions were for Malta twice, Romania and Slovakia. I would make 2 observations about that. The first one is while resolutions about Malta and Slovakia were triggered by the murder of journalists, corruption cases, and dysfunctional justice system in these cases, for Poland and Hungary, the concerns were about systemic threats to the rule of law. And Romania, at least until Sunday's referendum on justice and yesterday's conviction of Liviu Dragnea, seems to follow the same way. And second, if we put Malta aside, all concerns were raised over the situation in countries that joined the EU in the enlargement wave of 2004-2007. Countries that were also, despite quite different situations, part of the Soviet bloc before 1989. The question for the EU is, of course, how to address these identified threats to the rule of law. Article 7 is one way to do it, but we have to assess whether it has been successful so far and whether it can be in the future. Conditionality for EU funds is another possible way, which is currently being discussed in Brussels and that will probably be implemented one way or the other. But is a carrot and stick approach the right way to address not only the situation, but also the causes for it? And is it really a dissuasive tool for the future? Asking these questions and trying to find answers is first of all asking why we've come to that. Is it a product of EU's history since 1989, 2004, or especially since the migration crisis of 2015? Or is it a specific product of this part of Europe's history in the short and longer term? In other words, can the challenges to the rule of law in the EU be addressed by changing the EU or changing some of its member states, even by the use of a stick? Seen from a larger perspective, what lessons can we draw from the situation in Hungary, Poland, or Romania? And when we look at how Italy, for instance, and maybe France in the future, seem on the verge of sliding into illiberal democracies, and I will, by the way, let you discuss whether this much used expression is a correct way to define this challenge to the EU. To answer all these questions, I'm happy to have on this panel 2 Hungarians with probably 2 quite different views on the issue, a Bulgarian, a Slovene, and an Italian working in Germany, all knowing perfectly well the nuances of the European mind across the continent. So the speakers will be Constanza Sanhueza, who you are a research fellow at the Berlin Social Science and Research Associate at the Wiedem Institute. We have Péter Balázs. You are a professor at the Central European University and former EU Commissioner and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary. We have Ivan Krastev. You are the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and Sofia and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. We have Attila Steiner. You are the Deputy State Secretary for EU Relations at the Prime Minister's Office in Budapest. And we have Giga Turk from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, and you are from the Martens Center in Brussels, which is the think tank of the EPP. You in the audience, you can ask your questions on Slido. Probably most of you know how to use it now. We will also have a poll, which you will see on the screen, and you will be able to give your opinion on that. And of course, we will take a few questions from the audience. We have approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes for that. So I will start with you, Ivan Krastev. You publish many articles and even books about the divisions within the EU and the threats over the EU project. But I would start by asking you whether this specific issue of the rule of law is the main internal challenge facing the EU. Is it an existential threat to the EU as a project and as a political construction? Or is it, according to you, just a symptom of others' more profound ills in the EU?
I'm sure that on the panel there are people that know more than me about rule of law. What I know that in a democracy, in a certain way, the most important issue is to try to see how you're sharing sovereignty, basically, how much political interference from outside you can get. And this was quite important to understand because when we see certain type of political processes, you should try to understand that the real issue is not simply that according to the legislation, every European citizen should feel equally protected in every of the member state. But in a certain way, the major story is how much interference from Brussels the member states are going to tolerate. And from this point of view, if you look at the results of the European elections, you're going to get a very mixed picture. Look at the Romanian elections. Obviously, Romanian society stayed with Timmermans and basically believed that what their government is doing was abusing their privileges and rights. So you have the parties that have been very much siding with the fact that the rule of law has been violated, that get a lot of votes, not the governing party. On the other side, you have Poland, where basically you have a major story about the violation of the rule of law. The governing party basically get a very high election results. Why I'm saying this, you cannot totally divorce the problem of the rule of law and how it works from the domestic political process of the member states. And this is the paradox in a certain way of Central and Eastern Europe. There was this big survey that had been done by the ECFR trying to see, do you trust more national institutions, European institutions? And the paradox of Central and Eastern Europe is that while quite often we vote for parties that are going to be called Eurosceptic parties, at the same time the trust in European institutions can be higher in many of the countries than the trust in the national institutions. And the major story is that quite often people see in European institutions an ally against corrupt elites that they don't know how to deal with. I'm saying this because I do believe in the new parliament it's going to be very difficult to have any type of an Article 7 real majority being done. Because here people normally say what is the difference between the populist parties and the mainstream parties. Quite often people are voting not simply on the basis to which parliamentary group they belong, but to the fear that they believe that their country can end up being the next monitored country. And from this point of view, they are going to be a totally different kind of a balance in the European Parliament. And from my point of view, what is going to change dramatically is that instead of using this political mechanism, which is based on Article 7 and so on, you're going to see much more pressure going through the European courts. Mm-hmm. And this is the trend that I see, and I do believe from this point of view, these elections are very much strengthening this trend.
Thank you. Constanza Sanhueza, you have done some academic works on the state of the rule of law and maybe a definition of what could be threats to the rule of law in the EU. So can you give us maybe a quick overview of the situation in the EU on that matter? And is there only one model of the threat of the rule of law? Because we've seen from Brussels and a few member states, we look at just a small group of countries in very specific situations. And what conclusions can you draw from that on how the EU could react and operate to limit these challenges?
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to clarify, I'm here mainly in my capacity of research fellow of the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is based at the University of Gothenburg. And what VDEM does is that it collects data from more than 3,000 experts worldwide to assess 350 aspects of democracy for all countries in the world. So basically, we have yearly data on different aspects of democracy, including rule of law. And what I'm going to present you is the latest findings we have for 2018 for the EU countries in terms of this, in this area. Basically, the way we measure rule of law is an aggregate of different individual components, including compliance with the judiciary, court independence, restrictions to the executive, corruption, access to justice, and transparent laws. And by aggregating the scores of the different experts from the different countries, we're able to assess the situation of rule of law in each single country and and the trends that we observe in the most recent years. So worldwide, there is a decline on some aspects of democracy, including rule of law, including freedom of expression. The most visible aspects of democracy, like elections, they continue to improve because this is a facade to show that the country is democratic. But in reality, what's happening is that there is an undermining of the key pillars of democracy by attacking these aspects. And the EU countries are no exception, unfortunately. Although the EU countries are scoring better on average compared to other regions in the world, we see that in specific countries there is a deterioration of rule of law in recent years. Examples of these are Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, looking at rule of law overall. But if we look at specific aspects of rule of law, like corruption, we see that corruption is increasing in Lithuania and Bulgaria. It's also improving in other countries, but we need to keep an eye on this. At the same time, the executives are not respecting the constitution in many countries, and we have observed this, and our data also shows this. For example, in Moldova, Poland, Hungary, we see a decline of this. Transparent laws, so the process of defining laws and deciding is becoming more intransparent. And then there is no predictable reinforcement. This is the case of Hungary, Greece, but also France in recent years. And last example is access to justice. And we see that different social groups in society do not have equal access to justice. And this is particularly in Romania, Poland, also Bosnia, and other countries, particularly the countries that have democratized more recently in the EU. So basically, now to address your question on what can be done to reinforce this, we observe that, as it was mentioned before, the role of national governments and national institutions is crucial. But when governing parties and governments are failing to do this, and sometimes are the main actors attacking rule of law, for example, we have evidence for 2018 that in many Central and Eastern European countries, using social media, governments are disseminating disinformation, right, by which they are attacking these key pillars of democracy. It is important that the EU keeps an eye on these processes, because otherwise the key values of the EU, mainly democracy and these democratic values, are also being attacked. So basically, maybe to look at what can be done, promote check and balances, reinforce civil society and the independent media to make sure that there is diagonal and vertical accountability, promote stronger and transparent legal systems, design more measures to mitigate corruption at every level, legislative, executive, public sector. And also be aware that social media can be this tool that can help people complain, organize, protest, but also can be this media that can be used by governments to disinformate the public and further erode democracy.
So would you say that's, if we have to define the threats to the rule of law, it's a more general atmosphere rather than a specific action by a government, which is what we have been focused on probably? Do you think it's not exactly what a government does, but more how a general system and the society in itself is evolving that makes a challenge to the rule of law? You mentioned social media more than specific actions by governments, for instance.
No. In reality, the main challenges and threats to rule of law is coming from the government. The problem is that civil society sometimes is not strong enough or is very divided with high polarization, etc. So civil society, and maybe there is no independent media, etc., they are not able to keep the governments accountable for these actions. But basically, it is important to limit the power of the government as it should be. Make the government respect the laws and make the legal process more transparent.
Thank you. Péter, Balázs, you've been in a government in a country that is now under focus when we discuss this issue, and you've also been at the center of one of the elements of the threats on the rule of law with the Central European University. How would you exactly define a country where there is a threat to the rule of law? What, according to you, what have you seen and what do you see today in Hungary and other countries that, according to you, is the core problem when we want to look at the threats to the rule of law and how to address it? And what consequences, what impact does it have on other countries in the EU, which is one of the reasons why we think that we have to address these issues?
Okay, I think there are a few fundamental questions to be answered. There is a general European question, whether we are looking more for common solutions or individual, separate solutions. It's a question for all European states. Then, in what way are we approaching those problems, in a cooperative way or in a conflictual way? And then if we look for those countries which are preferring separate solutions and prefer conflictual relationships, then to our greatest surprise, we find the two former pioneers, Poland and Hungary. You have mentioned the various procedures. I have no answer. Why exactly those two early starters? I know a lot of answers, but not one single good explanation. As far as Hungary is concerned, take Mr. Orbán very seriously and listen his words, because he's usually saying in advance what he's going to do. 10 years ago, he defined a system, which is the system of national cooperation. The Hungarian abbreviation is well known in Hungary, NER. That system is about one single central power, which is there for governing the country for a very, very long time. This is an ambition for an exclusive power center. And later on, several years later, in one of his public speeches, he was the first to use that context of illiberal democracy. When Mrs. Merkel was in Budapest, she was asked at a press conference, what's your feeling about illiberal democracy? And she said, I cannot answer this question because it's either democracy or illiberal. I cannot put together the two elements into one concept. Now, let me give just a very few illustrations that what is really happening. Usually analyzers start with what we call the checks and balances. Most institutions that are there for controlling a political system and action have been occupied by the single ruling party. This is the situation with the Constitutional Court, with some surveilling bodies of jurisdiction, Court of Auditors, Chief Prosecutor, Competition Authority, and so on and so on. Second, there is a very clear centralization of the various branches of power which should be separated from each other. Because the Prime Minister as a party chief is selecting future members of the parliament in very personal talks. He's inviting them to his house and he designates the team. Hungary is a very special country where the Prime Minister, the President of the Republic, and the Speaker of the Parliament are coming from the same college dormitory. They were together 30 years ago, and they stayed together in a very active political team. The government is very small, the smallest government in the EU, roughly half of the size of a normal government, which prevents horizontal accountability. There is a vertical transparency of that government. Media is this is an estimation, 77% in government hands. Public radio and TV are disseminating government propaganda. The whole procedure has started with the media law back in 2010. New constitution under the name of a basic law, adopted only by government votes, no public debate, and it is not reflecting a nationwide acceptance with a 19th century preamble. And finally, election law, eliminating the very important first round of elections. There is a single round now. As long as we had 2 rounds, there was an opportunity mainly for smaller parties or opposition parties to forge alliances for the second round. Now this is out, redesigning constituencies, strict restrictions on party financing, on opposition parties, and so on and so on. So, short, this is a power forever formula. It is near to impossible to change the power. Centralized, monolithic, in a democratic package with a lot of democratic decorations. Some academic people try to call it a mixed power system, but for sure this is not a Western system. This is an Eastern system, and more similar to some post-Soviet or Central Asian states.
But when we listen to you, it could appear that what's happening in Hungary was, well, it was planned a long time ago by Viktor Orbán, you said that. And also you stressed the personal conditions, all these people knowing each other since they were students. So does that mean that Hungary is a very specific case that is related to a very specific country situation, that it's not replicable to other EU countries? Or do you see elements of that are dependent on the evolution of the EU itself, and not only to a long-term plan by one political leader? It seems that it's only Hungary, not the EU, that is at stake in what you describe.
Well, I think there is a worldwide expansion of individual nationalist attitudes, Hungary first, America first, anybody first, which is refusing cooperation, international norms, agreements, and negotiations. This is a worldwide danger. Hungary is an interesting test case because it went rather far on this road. Surprise, surprise, why exactly Hungary? But I try to give some explanations. And there is, of course, a real danger because the EU is not equipped for controlling or sanctioning such behavior, and this is acting against common norms, rules, and common interests and objectives, because Article 7 is the atomic bomb which would never blow up, because there is the veto possibility at the end of the day. So it wouldn't work at all. The procedure is a shaming action in itself, but some people are not sensitive on being shamed at all. More serious consequences should follow the break of common norms and rules. I think there are some faint ideas in the air, but not real action yet.
Attila Steiner, you're Viktor Orban's voice on this panel. Could you tell us what is exactly Viktor Orban's definition of democracy? Because we heard illiberal democracy that should be antagonistic, not going together. And don't you think that when you listen to other Europeans, when you look at outside Budapest and Hungary, don't you think Viktor Orban's vision is in minority in Europe, in his conception of democracy as it should fit in the EU project of shared values and rule of law?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the question. I think Viktor Orban has quite a clear understanding on what is democracy. So
it should fit in the EU project of shared values and rule of law.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the question. I think Viktor Orban has quite a clear understanding on what is democracy. So he grew up in an era where democracy was not present, and actually he was the person fighting for more democracy. So I think he has a very good understanding on democracy. What I think he understands under democracy, that's basically the rule of the people. And basically the system, how the people elect its representatives who will be legitimate to set up a state structure, a legal system in a legitimate way. I think in Hungary, of course, the government has an extraordinary track record. Since 3 times it won 2/3 majority in the national elections, and I think many problem comes from this fact, since this is not a common example in Europe, and most of the Western countries are used to such governmental structures where compromises and forming coalitions, it's the key. To establish a government, but in Hungary we have, as a legitimate result of legitimate elections, a 2/3 majority. I think here we can also connect the question to the rule of law question, since rule of law, we talk a lot about rule of law, but if we check the treaties, so basically there is no clear definition of rule of law in the treaties. There are some interpretations and there are some values described. However, I would regard rule of law more as a constitutional principle and as a result of the dialogue of different institutions and member states. And there are many different political and legal systems in different member states, and actually, therefore, how the rule of law requirements are implemented in the member states, they can differ. And that's very legitimate. That's also in the funding treaties, in Article 4, that also these differences shall be respected. Of course, the rule of law itself, but also the differences, how it's enforced. And so therefore, what institutions can do and member states can do, maybe compare, based on objective criteria, what is the performance of such systems. And there is, for example, one tool introduced by the European Commission. This is the Justice Scoreboard, which tries to give an overview on the performance of different legal systems in Europe. And if we have a look on this Justice Scoreboard, then you will find that Hungary is on average, or in several cases, a front-runner among European member states. So, for example, if we regard the number of infringement procedures, we are the 9th best. If we check the effectiveness of the case handling, we are in the top 3. So I think the picture is more complex, and it's very important to have a comparison also with other member states' practices. So if we talk about, for example, administrative court in Hungary that will threaten rule of law, we should have a look what is the practice in Europe. 10 other countries or 11 other countries have administrative courts established. As far as I know, here in the Czech Republic there is also a Supreme Administrative Court, and actually we took over the Austrian example even with more guarantees. So I don't think that should be per se establishing a new system, rule of law danger. And there is one very important aspect on rule of law. So basically the mechanisms which are available for institutions on rule of law, they are defined in the primary law of the European Union. And if we would like to introduce additional tools, then it requires a treaty change. Therefore, we completely agree with Chancellor Merkel's statement, who said that the mechanisms enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty are sufficient ones, and since the treaty change is not realistic now, the existing mechanism should be used more efficiently. So actually, we completely agree with this statement. I think there are already quite a lot of tools for the European Union available to enforce rule of law. There are the infringement procedures, which work quite well. As the last resort, there is also the Article 7 procedure. So when the infringement procedures are not working and a member state do not implement the rulings of the European Court of Justice, then that's a last resort. But let me highlight here the fact that Hungary has always implemented the rulings of the European Court of Justice, and in spite of this, we have an Article 7 procedure. So I think here it's very important to see what is the objective of these mechanisms, whether it is a political tool to make some conflict between member states and the political institutions, or it's a platform for a real increase in the rule of law system in Europe. It's a very delicate issue, since it's about the trust among member states. But if we would like to use it as a political tool, that it can easily result in mistrust and also creating new lines of division among member states and institutions. And I don't think that that's the future of Europe, to create internal conflicts.
You mentioned the rule of the people, and you said, if I heard correctly, that there is no clear definition of the rule of law. So do you mean that it's a relative concept that changes with the political interest of the government or the political sensibilities of the population? And don't you think in that case that weakens the basis on which a society or a EU or a political project as the EU can be built in the long term? Are you not just weakening the foundations of the common cooperation in the EU and even in the Hungarian society?
Yes, I think also the European Union project is also evolving, so it's not a constant, a fixed project. For example, we have now the Lisbon Treaty, and we see also some endeavors to make some adjustments to the Lisbon Treaty, but we think that the Lisbon Treaty is a good basis for the current cooperation, and I think that would be the government's point to get back to the Lisbon Treaty. So the institutions should concentrate on those competencies and tasks which are prescribed in the Lisbon Treaty. And for the government, of course, on the other side, it's very important to have a direct link and direct dialogue with the Hungarian nation. So therefore, in Hungary, a citizens' consultation, it's a very common tool which is used very frequently, and we had, I guess, 8 or 9 citizens' consultation with very high participation. That's also present in other European countries, but I think that that gives a good understanding for the government what are the real problems, and of course we are in a turbulent era now. We had a lot of crises behind us. There might be new challenges, and we need new answers.
Giga Turk. Péter Balázs said that the Article 7 was the atomic bomb which will never blow up. Do you think this approach, Article 7 and other political and institutional mechanisms, are they the right way to address these problems? And we see that it's not leading to a complete change in Poland, for instance, or in Hungary. So why, according to you, does it seem it's not working or not working yet?
Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the question. Before I answer it, I'd like to take a step back and look at the problem from the perspective of the topic that I study, which is called internet science. It may sound a funny word, but it's a study of how technology affects society, and more precisely what we are looking at is how information technology and the internet is affecting democracy. And first, of course, we want to know, understand what democracy actually is. And you can have a functional and you can have a technical definition of it, and functionally, I believe that democracy is a trust-building mechanism. So it's a mechanism of building trust between those with power and those that will be ruled. Technically, democracy is a communication engine, and some key feature of this communication engine are broken, and so the trust building of all of that is affected. In other words, there are systemic problems with democracy that are caused by different distribution of knowledge and information in society, and very different communication patterns caused by the internet and other communication technologies. We are finding that the problems are bigger in societies with either more advanced penetration of information technology, such as the United States, or weaker democratic traditions, such as Central and Eastern Europe or Central Asia. What is interesting is that it is not the first time that technology is disrupting political systems. In 1439, Gutenberg discovered movable type. In 1517, Luther published his thesis. In 1543, Henry VIII of England said Pope has no authority over England anymore. In 1648, after a 30 years war, Peace of Westphalia was signed, which set up kind of new rules of international relations. Basically, it means the abandonment of Catholic rule over Europe. Countries are sovereign, countries are equal. And as the last repercussion, I believe the French Revolution in 1789, the change of internal political system in one of the countries that led to democracy as we know it. Now, I think there are two landmark events here. One is the Peace of Westphalia, the other is the French Revolution. And the Peace of Westphalia is a landmark in the sense that before you would have Christian values which would be enforced all across Europe by the authority of the Pope. And after that, Europe still practiced Christian values, but they were not enforced by a central authority. And I believe this session is about European values as well, except that we are not speaking about Christian values anymore. We are speaking about democratic or liberal democratic values, and so on and so forth. And there seems to be a liberal consensus that these values are infringed, that these values are not respected in countries such as Poland, countries such as Hungary. There is less of a consensus that there are also problems in countries, like Spain, for going after with the old judiciary might after the Catalan leaders. There are grievances in Romania, there are grievances in Slovenia. The list that Mr. Balázs made about Hungary, almost point by point with a few exceptions I could relate to the Slovenian situation. So why is it that in the European Union we are not happy with the Westphalian principle anymore? The story goes that if member states cannot have confidence in their partner states, in other states, that they are democratic, that they respect the rule of law, the deep cooperation within the EU framework loses its basis. So as if if Hungary or Poland or Spain or any other countries are not democratic enough, these non-democratic practices would affect how decisions are being taken at the European level. And although I'm all for democracy, checks and balances, rule of law, etc., I think we yet have to see a proof of that. So what kind of damage, indeed so far, has Hungary and Poland made within Europe or to the European Union, to the workings of the European Union, to the common market, the four freedoms, and so on? You were asking about the solutions. I think there are two solutions which are in place, and there are two solutions in the drawing board. What we have in place is ultimately the European Court of Human Rights and the Venice Commission that can take decisions, and if one would find a systematic breach or a systematic pattern in the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, then indeed there is a problem in the country with respect to human rights. Same goes for the Venice Commission. There is Article 7, which is placed, which can be acted on, which probably should be acted on in some cases. Then you have the plan drawn up by Germany and Belgium, that there should be a kind of European semester, like there is one with respect to economy, that it should be one looking at the rule of law, not limited, picking up some countries as the bad boys, by looking and trying to improve everybody's performances. This, and before the elections, we were acquainted with the Weber plan, who I think correctly identified the problems with the use of Article 7 and the procedures in the Lisbon Treaty, and that is that at the end of the day, when it comes to invoking Article 7 or using any of the other tools in the treaties, if this is left to the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission, these decisions tend to be or could be believed to be political. So you would have majority that would vote against a minority, which is in fact a deeply non-democratic process. So what Weber is proposing is a kind of wise man, senior judges commission that would be systematically, of course, looking at cases like that, which to some extent I think is a duplication of the Venice Commission and of the European Court of Human Rights. So I think there are things to do, but I think we should proceed with care. Because as I think Ivan said, we have, I think, very bad understanding of other speakers are saying at this podium because of the echo. But I think what Ivan was saying is that actually all those national leaders who are trying to protect their nations from Brussels or from top authorities are getting even more popular by that. So let's not make them even more popular by taking steps which will be futile in the end, and have no results but strengthening them.
So are you advocating in a way to depoliticize the actions to address the rule of law issue? You mentioned the Court of Human Rights, you mentioned the European semester, which would be probably according some predefined criteria. And what about the role of civil society in these countries and at EU level? You mentioned the role of communication, and of course we see that there is some public support to these governments in Poland, in Hungary. We saw that with the results on Sunday. So what about the role of societies in the countries and in the EU, and should there be some direct action to strengthen, to give more role to civil societies as a counterbalance?
I must confess I'm very critical on the, let's say, suppression is probably too strong a word, but at the discouragement of the work of civil society organizations in some member states. I think civil society is, especially in the communication environment as we have with the internet and all that, a very, very powerful mechanism to be one of those checks and balances to the real power, and should be encouraged to work. And as to depolitization, I very strongly think that there should not be kind of a shadow of a doubt that there is a kind of political motivation behind some of the activities.
Thank you. I had originally planned to have a second round of questions before going to the audience, but I see we have a lot of questions from the audience on Slido, which is very good. Thank you very much. And many of them are anonymous, so I don't know if it's because it's difficult to have an account, or if it's because of this specific issue that people prefer to ask with the discretion. Maybe I will take the first one on the list. Given the results of the European elections, Fidesz with over 50%, how does this change the arguments raised against Hungary, given clear public support? So maybe, Péter, Balázs, you want to answer that question?
Yes, it was 52% majority of Fidesz, which resulted in 13 seats in the European Parliament out of the 21 for Hungary. In itself, this is a great victory. If we consider that highly unfair position of the government side, we had parliamentary elections in Hungary last April. And even before, government propaganda went on about one single issue. This is to stop immigration. There is no immigration in Hungary at all. A few dozens of unfortunate people try to cross the big fence on the border, but there was one very big, unprecedented wave back in 2015. But since the government side is living on that issue, trying to influence the public that we are the only one who could protect you from a second big invasion which is imminent because millions are waiting. Then the trick is that Hungary has never been a target country like Sweden or Germany, has been a transit country. Since there is a fence on the border, people have just taken the Croatian and Slovenian route instead of crossing Hungary. So it hasn't changed anything. Government information is serving political purposes. This is one thing. And public support is an interesting thing because, again, this is a general phenomenon that our country first. We are the best people in the world. This is an identity politics, which is a kind of extended nationalism. We're not putting the emphasis on our wonderful nation, but white Christian people. White Christian people are in danger, and let us protect you. And this works. Of course, in the background, there is this very sweet nationalism, which in Hungary is always mixed up with revanchism and some historical wounds and losses. And it works. It works when it is distributed. If you listen, the government television chain, it always starts with news about migration. What happened in Bosnia? What happened in Sweden? What happened in Holland? Nothing in Hungary, because nothing is happening. But this is impressing people that you are under threat.
Another very interesting question. Are EU institutions breaching their competencies and threatening the national sovereignty by investigating this problem as violating fundamental values of the EU? So, in a way, should the EU step out completely of what's happening? It's a bit the reference to the Westphalian Order as well. Is the EU doing too much when it goes into the internal politics and internal institutional, maybe even Christoph, if you want to answer?
Let's start with the fact, sorry, yeah, it's a noisy topic. Basically, I want to start somewhere earlier. The problem is the following. Why people are going to support concentration of power in the executive? And the case of Hungary is very specific because of the constitutional majority that can change constitution and others. Let's go on this. What is the problem with the liberal democracy that allows this type of a governments to get certain type of support? And one of them is that the good story about democracy is that when you're losing, you're not losing too much. You're not going to lose your life, you're not going to lose your property. But when you're winning, you're also not winning too much. And from this point of view, what is interesting is that what we see in my view in Europe, which is changing a lot, is the very politics is changing. We go to a much more polarized politics. And when in a polarized political environment, you start to talk about the neutral institutions and say, let's depoliticize, they're highly politicized. And they're highly politicized because they're used for political purposes. And this is why I do believe this is a much more structural crisis for the European Union that does not go simply in one country or the other. There are countries which are much more extreme, but European rule of law thinking was very much based in a system. Is it better now?
No.
Yeah. Sorry for this.
So in the meantime, I will remind you that there is a poll that is open on Slido, and the question is, should rule of law be a conditionality for EU funds? So you can answer by yes or no, and we'll see the results.
I'm just going to repeat the most kind of a basic argument. And the most basic argument is the following. Our idea of the rule of law and how it worked in the last 20 years was based on the fact that we have a quite highly consensual politics in most of our countries. This also consensual politics was based on the fact that you have a total domination of the center-left and center-right in the political party systems of what we have. And we are now starting to have a much more polarized political system in which you're not simply fighting to win the elections, you start to see your political opponent as an enemy. And one of the things that I find highly problematic, to be honest, in countries like Hungary and Poland, it's not simply what is done, but it's the discourse. And this is not to be coordinated by the European Union. But if you're going to basically frame every opposition activity as an enemy activity, this is changing the nature of the politics. And the biggest question is how the European Union can function in this type of environment when it comes to interference. And on one level, there is a tendency of the European institution to go there and to believe that they can do this or that without seeing their actions as political actions. They are political actions, for sure, because as a result of it, you're going to benefit certain political groups and you're basically going to hurt others. So this type of a hypocrisy is hurting, but on the other side, you cannot simply allow countries to do anything that they want in their own political system and to believe that we have a common political space in which people, goods, and others can move directly. So from my point of view is not simply how to do with the rule of law, but how better to come and to kind of reconcile the drive of the people that their vote matters, which is real, and this is behind different political parties, not only on the far left or far right. And on the other side, the fact that we are living in a common space, and from this point of view, what is happening in Bulgaria should be interesting also for somebody living in Germany or in France, because otherwise it's not going to work. And for the moment, I don't believe that we have found the balance. I'm not a great supporter of the idea that you're going to punish the countries by stopping money, for a very simple reason. When you're trying to tell East Europeans that if you're not going to basically keep the rule of law, we're not going to give you money, all the talk about values starts to look very strange. Are you buying countries? The second issue, and this is why I do believe that the political process is critically important, and this is why it's not simply civil society. By the way, when we say civil society, we normally believe that this is only a kind of a liberal groups. There are many kind of groups. Mr. Farage, before having a party, was a civil society too. So civil society space is also very much contested. And I do believe European Union now is working in a totally different environment. And in this totally different environment, for me, the critically is how the investors are going to behave. Honestly speaking, the problem of the nationalism of the countries and the member states is that this is nationalism in the absence of the national economies. If there is a problem of rule of law, and if, for example, BMW see this problem in Hungary, and if they decided basically to act on this, I do believe that the Hungarian government is going to be much more concerned than about any of the decisions that, and I'm giving Hungary, it's about any country. I don't basically believe that Hungary and Poland are the only ways. But I do believe this is an important story. It cannot be simply being Brussels sanctioning one country, so Brussels coming with report for every country, because what is behind the Weber plan, and I have been talking a lot to Mr. Weber, is when you start to have a report about every countries, and the very idea that ex-judges can solve a classical political problems. This is also a kind of a very German view of the world, because at the end of the day, in the same institutional frame, you can have a very different constitutional regimes. Power can be exercised totally different. And there is a real problem with concentration of media. Hungarian case is just obvious. There is no, by the way, Poland is different from this point of view. You have a public media that have been very much misused by the government, but the private media is functioning in a totally different environment. So how to go and to make it important, not simply for Brussels, but for the other governments, for the other political parties, and also for the investors, in my view, this is the way to rebalance this, and not simply believing that it can work if Brussels is sanctioning one country or the other, because it can backfire, and it can backfire in a big way. It can change and create a different type of nationalism where sovereignism is defined as simply resisting the European Union.
A follow-up question on that to Attila Steiner. You said that Hungary always respected the EU Court of Justice decisions. So to follow up on that question, do you agree on the principle that the EU has a right to look into the countries and to see how the justice system, the rule of law are functioning, even if in your case, or maybe in the case of Poland, you oppose the political reasons for that. But in principle, do you think the EU as an institutional and political body has a right to look into its member states? And a second question on this European semester idea, well, kind of European semester idea put forward by Belgium of a review of all countries. Do you support that idea? Do you think it would be a good alternative to what is in place, or a good complement to what is in place?
Yes, thank you. Let me start with the second part, with the so-called peer review proposal of Belgium and Germany. So we think that there might be a good proposal. Of course, it depends on the details. So if there are sufficient safeguards that this procedure will ensure a fair comparison and objective comparison of different member states, then we might support this proposal. But there is one very important precondition, that it should be on an intergovernmental basis. Because currently we don't see that the treaty framework enables to establish new structures. So new structures could be only established if there is a consensus on that among member states, and if that's the way, and actually that's the Belgian proposal, then that might make sense also for us. But here it would be very important to see how it will look like in the practice. If, for example, the idea will be that it should be a thematic peer review, so basically we identify an area and we compare all of the 28 or 27 member states' practices, and we have a discussion based on that comparison, then I think it can improve the overall situation. What I see that we are in the middle of the Article 7 procedure, and there is quite a limited knowledge on other member states' practices. So we are very often criticized for such things which are already existing in several member states. And I think Article 7 is a very good example on the questions, on the institutional roles. You might know that the Hungarian Article 7 procedure was initiated by the European Parliament, but for example, in case of Poland, the Article 7 procedure was triggered by the European Commission as a last resort, since infringement procedures were not enough. So therefore, the Hungarian procedure is a little bit different, with different roles of the institutions. Of course, the Commission is there at the table, but this is now the member state circle. So the Commission can be there, can make a report how the actual open infringement procedures look like, because in the key issues we have still open procedures, they are not closed. And that's what the Commission has done until now, and of course we delivered also a lot of information for member states to have a better understanding on our opinions. And the second question is, what is the role of the European Parliament on this procedure? We think that at this stage, the European Parliament should not be there in the Council session. They had the right to initiate the process, and they will have the right, if there is a voting, to give their consent on the result of the vote. So they will be in, but we think that to preserve this interinstitutional balance it's very important. Actually, we are in close cooperation with the Commission since 2010. We had many debates. I do not want to hide it. But finally, we had always an agreement. And finally, we agreed on the key issues. We implemented the court's decision. So I don't think that we are much worse than other member states. It's quite normal that countries have infringement procedures. If we check the numbers, Germany has more infringement procedures than Hungary. So I think this dialogue, ongoing dialogue, and getting into the details is very important. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and the European Commission has the sufficient resources to dig into the details. So therefore, we consider this dialogue very important. And of course, we also joined the acquis communautaire, so there are rules we would like to fulfill, and we are committed to fulfill. And I think that's the track record of the Hungarian government, that if there was a problem, a concrete proposal, or concrete request for change, then it was implemented.
Thank you. Another question from the audience on Slido, one probably inspired by your point, Constanza, from Bruno Alari. In a democratic Europe, what is the most important, the rule of law or the rule of election?
Right, I think both dimensions are important, and I think it's important to clarify. So the rule of election is very important in order to have democracy, but oftentimes you have electoral autocracies that run elections that, like, the setup seems pretty democratic, but in reality they are not respecting minority groups. There is no constraints to the government. So having both dimensions are important for liberal democracy. Just to give you examples, on liberal democracies, we have many liberal democracies in Europe, but also we have several countries that have switched to what we kind of conceptualize as electoral democracy because rule of law is so weak, including Hungary, Lithuania. But then we have other countries, particularly in other parts of the world, that have electoral autocracies, like Venezuela, right? So having both dimensions is very important, to have the people represented, to have constraints on the government, and so for a good functioning democracy.
So should the EU have a corps of observers to elections within the EU, national elections, national referendums, or even EU elections, to ensure that the standards are respected within the EU? And do you think member states would accept that?
Right. I think it's important. I think it's an important practice. I think increasingly more countries and governments are realizing that clean elections, fair elections are important, because otherwise they get criticized by the media, they get criticized by international organizations. But it is important also to work on these other dimensions that are more subtle: rule of law, freedom of association, freedom of speech.
Okay. I saw another question which was interesting, maybe not easy to answer, but maybe Gigatur could try to answer. Is the pessimism of EU citizens mainly due to societal or cognitive reasons?
I'm not quite sure how to interpret that question or how to understand it. Maybe the person who wrote it meant, is pessimism related to thinking on your own or to kind of peer pressure on the social networks, or is it rational versus intuitive? And I mean, frankly, we live in the best part of the world in terms of standards, in terms of quality of life, in terms of human rights, in terms of opportunities for education and travel and work and air conditioning if you want. So I think pessimism is a kind of luxury that you can have if you are rich, well-to-do, with no pressing worries. You don't have to toil from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening, but you're on the internet and you're being pessimistic. I think it's not really true. I think this pessimism does not really materialize. These people are not looking to move to New Zealand or Australia or Singapore or China, not to mention Russia or Kazakhstan. These pessimistic people are not moving their bank accounts to other countries which would be more suitable. They are not thinking about marrying abroad. So I think we would need to look deeper into this pessimism, and it's I think it's a signal, it's a virtue signal, it's a pose. It is not something that guides your day-to-day activities, that guides your material impact on the world. And I would agree to that quote. Somebody said, well, things are not as bad as the intellectuals would need them to be for their pessimism.
Thanks. A question by Estelle Beuve. Would it be possible to change the unanimity principle leading the EU to a political stalemate, to take actions again? I lost it. Well, we know that unanimity can block the last step of Article 7, so would it be better not to have this unanimity principle? I don't know who wants to answer that. Peter Balázs, maybe.
Well, I happened to be there when this unfortunate treaty was drafted as a draft constitution in the European Convention. And I can remember the high discussions about Article 7. And this was the last chance for member states to prevent the full application and implementation of that article, to insert this veto. We would need unanimity to change this unanimity rule, which is a contradiction in itself. It is not possible. So some monitoring devices, European semester, and others on a perfectly equal basis for all the member states, like it is working in the Eurozone about macroeconomic indicators. It would be very useful, and then we should think, because this kind of cross-sanctioning, punishing, for instance, media freedom with holding back EU money for road building, it's a nonsense. It doesn't work. A system should be feasible in itself. So rewards and punishments should be part of the same system, and not cross-cutting linkages with remote issues, because this is not a real punishment that if the freedom of speech is not working, then we suspend the building of a bridge. It doesn't work either in a nation state or at the European level. So it's a great challenge, but the fundamental problem that we are not equipped for that, because the whole construction was based on a voluntary submission to common norms and rules. And this doesn't work. when some countries believe that they could make a one-sided use, taking all the benefits and refusing all the obligations at the same time, changing the balance. And this is the problem.
So, to that regard, do you understand the argument which is behind this conditionality proposal of they accept, they are only interested, these countries are only interested by our money, so the only way or the best way to oblige them to come back to a better rule of law is to cut the fund or to put some conditionality on them. So do you agree not with the solution, but at least with the starting argument of that?
Well, I think that instead of that very rude direct sanctioning, some new technicalities are coming up, and then some creative ideas are there. For instance, in the transport area, the so-called blended course, that EU support is not only granted, which shouldn't be paid back, but it is mixed with European Investment Bank loans, with private bank financing, and once there is a bank in the game, there is real surveillance. And no interest groups can take away the money because there is no real control. This is one of the techniques, and there could be several others which could be used in a much better way. But I can see some contours are also already visible in the draft multi-annual financial framework.
Mm-hmm. There was a question about the role of the EPP in Hungary's case, which makes me think that we have discussed the role of the EU institutions, but not the role of EU parties. And of course, there is Viktor Orban with the EPP, but also PiS in the ECR. There is the case of Romania, the PSD government with the PES, and also within the ALDE, there is the case of a prime minister, which is not far from here. So do you think that's the responsibility of obliging the governments and, by consequence, the parties leading the governments? This responsibility should be also, or mainly, or maybe mainly within the European parties, that maybe they have a better role to play this shame game or sanction game in the EU. Maybe before we come to a sanction process, these parties should have a role, even Cluster, for instance.
I find it very important because in a certain way, we all the time when we talk about sanctions and so on, we look for the institutional mechanism. And for example, you can say European Union cannot do much about this and that. To be honest, some of these governments are also paying a price because this is about their informal influence with their peers and basically about certain groups. To be honest, the Hungarian government paid the price for the CEU. This price is going to be that Viktor Orban was a very important figure in the EPP. And on certain policies, for some of them for right positions, he could influence his colleagues. At the moment when his colleagues in Germany believe that he's costing them votes, German votes, not Hungarian votes, this is changing the position, and I do believe this is the same for every country. So from this point of view, I much more believe in this type of a peer pressure, because it's not only institutions, it's not simply the movement of kind of money that is important. There is a reputation cost for everybody. And from this point of view, every political leader and every party leader is trying to maximize not simply his vote at home, but his influence in European Union. Because this is going to have results when it comes to the budget negotiations, comes to everything. I really do believe that the fact that Fidesz was part of a mainstream important political party grouping like EPP allowed Hungary to be much more influential and flexible when it comes to basically pressure from outside than PiS, which was not part of a big group in the European Parliament. So from this point of view, I very much believe that this is one of the effective ways it works. On the other side, of course, the fact that Hungarian government is winning 52% at home is also going to affect the way others basically are looking at it. But this is politics. And what makes me kind of nervous is that we try to see all these relations about the rule of law on the level of the European Union. If this is a sphere that has nothing to do with politics, is the way people are voting, is the way basically people are competing, it makes a difference. And from this point of view, Fidesz out of EPP is not the same like Fidesz within the EPP when it comes to influence political decisions.
Mm-hmm. Constanza, given all the information you have in your academic work, and what do you think of this distribution of roles between institutions, justice system at EU level, and political parties at EU level? Who can address what kind of failings that you can see?
I mean, it is important to realize that the role of political parties is very important, right? Like, when they are elected, basically they are the ones also reinforcing these institutions. But at the same time, it's important to have strong institutions that might limit also the possibilities that parties have to undermine these very same institutions. It's like a little bit circular. But I think like we are now following the last election facing new challenges. I mean, we have new actors that were not as strong before. Also, participation was very high, which is good. But there's going to be a challenge of having more actors in the table and having to find agreements with all these actors with growing skepticism across Europe. So I think it's important to try to keep strong institutions, respect the rules, but at the same time give parties the possibility to kind of work further on what Europe could imagine, right? Because there are new challenges coming, and we cannot be somehow square and just limit ourselves to what has been defined and have this path dependency only, but try to imagine vis-a-vis the future, what needs to be done in order to address the new challenges. So there has to be a little bit of flexibility, but at the same time respect for the rules and reinforce these institutions in the making.
Mm-hmm. We have a few minutes left, so I would like to know if there are questions that were not asked through Slido. The gentleman on the third row, Monsieur Michelot.
Thank you. Martin Michel, I'm the Deputy Director of Europeum. Just as a side note, before I even start, as a French, I'm very troubled when I hear that Article 7 is, the atomic bomb, because I think that in a way, if you think of French nuclear deterrence, which is what it's a reference to, you're watering down deterrence by saying that this is the atomic option. So I think we should almost not use this term, and this is perhaps something we can discuss. The second thing on Article 7, my question to you is, do you believe that the next Finnish presidency of the Council will actually play a more active role than the current Romanian presidency in bringing this issue to the General Affairs Council? Because the next step in Article 7 is for there to be regular hearings in the General Affairs Council, and we've seen that in this presidency, the Romanians have not been very proactive. So, I mean, do you think that the presidency should play actually a bigger role in this? The other institution which can play a very big role on rule of law issues is the European Court of Justice. And we've seen that in the Polish case, the most efficient, in a way to discuss issues with Poland has actually been the European Court of Justice issuing rulings asking for Poland to reinstate judges, and in fact starting to mention the fact that the mutual trust between the judicial systems may be broken down. And this is actually one of the fundamental values of the European Union, and this is not political. So at the end of the day, the question is, I mean, should these discussions be simply legal within the justice system, and should we just completely eliminate the political discussions? Because as we see, I mean, there can be 3-4 hour hearings of Poland, but at the end, nothing much comes out of it, except for a couple questions from mostly Western European and Northern European countries. Thank you very much.
Wants to answer?
Well, I can remember some excellent Finnish presidencies in the past, so I'm highly confident that the high efficiency of Finnish diplomacy will work. At the same time, I can see at least two main difficulties for our Finnish friends. One is that, as it is well known, the second semester presidency is the short one. The first one is the long one. The first one is going from January to June. The second one is starting in reality in September, and it's a 3-month presidency from September to the middle of December. It is a very short period. Second, we will focus on the selection of the new European Commission. Now we have got the Parliament. Parliament will meet for the first time in July, as usual, and they would start their activities. But everybody will focus on the hearings of the candidates for the commissioner post, then the approval in the European Council and in the European Parliament, then the distribution of the portfolios within. So this is occupying that very short period, and the Commission may enter in office by November. So we are very late with the discussions about the new long-term budget. And I think the main challenge for the Finnish presidency would be to take up the line and to relaunch the discussion with the new actors, new European Parliament, new European Commission, about finalizing the multi-annual financial framework. It will be an extremely difficult period.
Shiga, Turkey wanted to answer.
Yes, if I may add some points here. Before telling some words about our experience and what happened and what will happen in our case, in Hungary's case, I think it's important to clarify the procedure itself. Maybe it's not, everybody's not familiar with it. So basically it's not a quick procedure. It's not that tomorrow we will have a vote on unanimity vote whether we should suspend Hungary's voting rights. It's a very long procedure. It has two steps. The first step is a preventive step, where there is a discussion with the member state, and that will be a hearing. The format will be a hearing, and then based on that, the Council will determine whether there is a systematic risk of infringing basic values, and if this vote will happen, it's a 4/5 vote within the Council, and the European Parliament should give a consent on that. Then we enter into the second phase, where the Council will give recommendations to Member States. There is a monitoring and discussion how it is implemented, and if it's not implemented, the issue is not solved, then there is a final vote with unanimity. So this is the procedure. And I think the Polish case showed that they had already 3 hearings, but actually the whole procedure is not progressing. So we would need some more effective organization of that hearing. We don't know when it will come. Maybe it will come in June or in July or in the second semester. It depends on the majority of the member states within the Council. They can put it on the agenda. We had, with the Austrian presidency, 3 times state of play and exchange of views. And actually the key question was what is the role of the different institutions, since it's a very unique procedure and it was not initiated by the European Commission. And we were already 2 times on the agenda during the Romanian presidency, but there was no majority from the member states to put a hearing on the agenda. I think the Finnish presidency will be very active on this issue, and what we expect from the Finnish presidency, since it's a rule of law procedure, the rules should matter, and we would like to have a fair, objective trial, and we are there and ready for explaining our views to all of the questions.
Shiga, the last one for you.
Yeah. I mean, if the problem is rule of law, then even more so the problem has to be dealt in the spirit of the rule of law. Dryly as possible, as non-politically as possible. And as our debate here has shown, what will this presidency do? What will that presidency do? What about the next commission? What about the next parliament? This only tells you how politicized the whole thing has become, and maybe this case needs to set up a precedent how to isolate these issues from political horse trading. And yes, it is Article 7. It is not an atomic option. It is an article in the treaty and procedures that are behind it. Just be as dry as possible about it.
Thank you very much. We've come to the end of this discussion. Now there is a break of 20 minutes, and then please don't forget 2 parallel panels starting at 11:40. The first one on EU sovereignty and strategic autonomy, and the second one on Industrial Revolution 4.0. Thank you to all our panelists. Thanks.
Thank you.